Hello everyone, and welcome back to yet another console hardware breakdown video where today we are going to cover the Xbox One X and its GPU, codename Cactus. The Xbox One X was a sleek, jet black monolith of raw power designed to bring 4K gaming into the living room for the first time on the Xbox One platform. So today we're going to dive into its specs and then give, of course, a deep dive into its GPU and the improvements that were made over the base Xbox One. But before we begin, if you are new here, consider subscribing to catch my weekly uploads, and if you like this video, please smash the like button. That way YouTube will actually show this video off to others who may enjoy it as well. I really appreciate all your support. Now let's just dive right into it. So of course this video is going to mostly cover the Xbox One X GPU and how it pushed the One X to provide incredible graphics at up to 4K resolutions. But the truth is the Xbox One X received large improvements to other components on top of its much larger and faster GPU as well. So we'll break down those specs and give an idea of what was improved. And for starters, the Xbox One X CPU used the same 8-core AMD Jaguar processor as the base Xbox One, but the clock speed was increased by over 30%, from 1.75 GHz in the base model to 2.3 GHz in the Xbox One X. Now, this definitely did not remove the bottleneck the Jaguar CPU caused for last-gen consoles, but it was a notable increase in CPU performance to help ensure more consistency with higher frame rate 60 FPS titles, as well as boosting load times ever so slightly. So it was definitely a welcome upgrade, and better to have than not. The next major upgrade on the Xbox One X was its RAM configuration, packing 12 GB of GDDR5 memory running on a 384-bit memory bus, providing 326 GB a second of memory bandwidth, 9 GB of which were reserved for games and 3 GB for the operating system. This RAM upgrade was a massive improvement, increasing RAM by 50% from the base console's 8 GB of DDR3 RAM, as well as increasing the total memory bandwidth by over 450% from 68 GB a second, while also completely foregoing the more complicated ESRAM. This increase in capacity and speed in the memory over the base Xbox One was essential to help support the resolutions the One X was aiming for, as well as support the vastly superior GPU power in the console. Now, of course, the star of the show, the Xbox One X Cactus GPU, which I like saying. I honestly did not know it was Cactus. I was surprised. I had to re-look into this a couple of times to make sure I wasn't getting bogus information. But this GPU was the most massive improvement made over the base console, sporting 40 compute units, each containing 64 shaders, for a total of 2,560 shaders altogether that worked simultaneously, handling all of the parallel processing tasks to perform arithmetic, logic, and memory operations that are crucial for rendering graphics. The GPU was clocked at 1172 MHz and was based on a customized version of AMD's GCN 4.0 Polaris architecture. It had 160 texture mapping units for mapping 2D images onto 3D surfaces and providing details and realism to the graphics, as well as 64 render output units, which handled all the finishing stages of the rendering pipeline, handling all the blending, anti-aliasing, and final pixel data as it hits your screen. All of these specs were huge upgrades over the base Xbox One, with just 12 CUs in comparison at 853 to 914 MHz, depending on if it's a One S or the VCR Xbox One, and had 48 texture mapping units and just 16 render output units. The GPU was also a custom Polaris architecture AMD GPU, which meant it was the same lineage as the later 400 and 500 Radeon series PC GPUs, and was about on par with the Radeon 580 for a PC equivalent comparison. But obviously the Xbox One X GPU came with custom tweaks to prioritize console efficiency. This efficiency was likewise improved between the two consoles and generations of AMD architectures between Polaris in the Xbox One X and Sea Islands in the Xbox One, and was able to provide 4.5 times more graphical performance than the base Xbox One, but only needed to about double its max energy consumption to do so, jumping from 120 watts in the 1.4 teraflop Xbox One S to 245 watts for the 6 teraflop Xbox One X. This also included powering the higher CPU clock speeds and other components as well, so it was pretty impressive if you think about it. Now, all these specs I talked about are great, but let's look at the actual numbers and explain what they mean as far as specific performance capabilities go. Now, I just mentioned it, but the main headline stat everyone knows about the Xbox One X and its GPU was that it was capable of 6 teraflops. Now, what this means is that it's just able to do 6 trillion floating point operations per second. In simpler terms, it tells you how much raw calculation power the GPU has. So, therefore, more teraflops equals better at complex lighting, physics, and rendering effects. specs, yada yada yada. Now there is, of course, more to this that determines real-world performance, especially between different architectures, and other components can bottleneck this as well. But this number was 4.3 times higher than the base Xbox One VCR model and provided a context for anyone to go off of when getting an idea of how much more powerful the Xbox One X was over its base sibling. It was also able to pump out 75.5 gigapixels for a pixel fill rate, calculated by multiplying its GPU clock speed by its 64 render output units. This metric shows how many complete pixels the GPU can output per second onto the screen. A higher rate means higher resolutions and frame rates are more achievable, as well as reduces bottlenecks when rendering complex scenes with multiple layers, such as motion blur or even post-processing. Finally, it was able to achieve 187.5 gigatexels per second for a pixel fill rate. Similar to the pixel fill rate calculations, we simply take the GPU clock speed and multiply it by its 160 TMUs to get this figure. Pixel fill rate measures how fast texture elements can be mapped onto geometry or polygons per second. The higher this number is, the more detailed, higher resolution textures can be used, especially at close distances or even just larger surfaces. Now, all three of these performance measurements were indicative of the improvements made with all of the hardware that I've just discussed in the Xbox in the GPU specifically, with the addition of so many render output units and texture mapping units and compute units, as well as higher clock speeds, before we even consider any of the memory or CPU enhancements. The Xbox One X, for example, provided 5.5 times higher pixel fill rate over the base Xbox One, up from its 13.65 gigapixels per second pixel fill rate, and over 4.5 times the texel fill rate of the Xbox One, which sat at just 40.94 gigatexels per second, and over 4.5 times the total floating point operations performance from 1.3 or 1.4, again depending on which base Xbox we're referring to, up to its 6 teraflop number. And as you can see from the two console spec comparisons side by side on the screen, every single gaming related piece of hardware is boosted to provide the One X user with more than just above 1080p resolution capability that could extend up to 4K and anywhere in between. But it also allowed for improved graphics for games in general, with many examples of titles also having improved texture quality, draw distances, shadow resolutions, and even frame rate stability across a wide range of games when compared to the base Xbox One. And on paper, between what you see with the two different metrics of performance and the base hardware spec being improved, it seems like the Xbox One should have been able to deliver more than it actually did. And as I mentioned earlier in the video, the Xbox One X still did suffer from CPU bottlenecks due to the CPU being the exact same, just sporting a 31+%-ish higher CPU clock speed on an otherwise exact same Xbox One base console CPU. And so if a game suffered from heavy CPU bottlenecks on the last gen consoles in general due to their low power focus and slow Jaguar architectures, regardless of clock speed, and I mean all of them, from PlayStation, PlayStation 4 Pro to the Xbox One and Xbox One X, there was really no way to scale graphics back enough to get beyond 30 FPS or other type of limits due to the unacceptable instability when doing so caused by said CPUs. Even if the GPU could handle more and had overhead to do so and to be optimized for, such as lower draw distances, LODs, lower resolutions, I mean, you name it, there's a ton of ways to optimize for graphics. But at a certain point, other hardware constraints can just make it impossible to accommodate any of these things. But the Xbox One did have a trick up its sleeve to max out its most major hardware improvements, and that was the higher resolution targets that it aimed for. You see, the higher the resolution, the less you have to worry about a CPU bottleneck getting in the way. And what I mean by this is, if a CPU isn't going to allow for graphics of a game to be optimized any better than it is, for the GPU to do whatever is needed to achieve 30 plus FPS anyway, then just crank up the resolution and utilize the GPU as much as possible without adding anything that is CPU heavy processing. This example of a resolution bump is perfect because it alone allows your game to have less aliased edges, sharper textures both close and afar, as well as more details in the finer things of the game world, and the CPU doesn't feel much added stress in doing all this. Anyway, that's all I have for you guys in today's video. I hope you enjoyed it. These current and recent generation consoles are pretty easy to cover because although the technology is advanced and capable, it's definitely a lot more straightforward and more PC-like than ever before. So these videos tend to be more of an information dump than anything else, but I still think it's fun to dive into, and I still find this stuff really fascinating. So if you've sat here this long, you probably do too, and I consider you a top supporter and my Rambo squad. So please comment down below that you've been here the whole time so I can reach out to you and thank you personally for supporting this channel. Or just tell me some of your favorite memories with the Xbox One X down below. And I hope I see you all in next week's video, where I'll be covering the PlayStation's mid-gen refresh, the PlayStation 4 Pro. Until then, I wish you guys a great morning, afternoon, or evening. Peace.